The scent of time was Ilara's only constant companion. It was a fragrance of decaying paper, brittle leather, and the faint, sweet perfume of dried glue, an aroma that clung to her clothes and skin like a second self. In the hushed sanctuary of her workshop, surrounded by the silent, sleeping stories of centuries past, she moved with a reverence that bordered on worship. Her slender fingers, stained with ink and restoration paste, traced the faded gilt of a 17th-century spine, her touch as delicate as a moth's wing. She was a ghost in this library of ghosts, a curator of lives lived with passion and fury, yet her own life was a blank, unwritten page, bound in silence and duty. The silence of the grand, decaying house was a living thing, and soon, a force far more powerful than history would come to shatter it. If you want to witness the moment her silent world collides with a storm of secrets and desire, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment with where you're watching from. We continue. Her name was Ilara Vance, and at 22 she possessed the quiet, unassuming grace of a forgotten portrait. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this room, a space crammed with the tools of her trade: bone folders, finishing presses, and pots of carefully mixed pigments. She was a restorer of antique books, a profession that suited the gentle precision of her nature. It was a legacy passed down from her grandfather, the only inheritance of value that remained. Each day, she meticulously mended the wounds of time: a torn page, a broken binding, a water-stained cover, finding a somber satisfaction in making things whole again. Yet, this act of restoration was a cruel mirror. While she could piece together the fragmented histories of others, her own life felt irreparably fractured, a collection of duties and expectations that belonged to everyone but herself. Her innocence was not a choice but a circumstance, a delicate glass wall built by years of quiet sacrifice. Ilara was a virgin, a truth she held not with pride or shame, but with a sense of inevitability, as if it were a preordained part of her cloistered existence. Her youth had been offered up on the altar of filial piety, spent in the dim, oppressive rooms of the Vance estate as the sole caretaker for her ailing father. While other women her age were discovering love, passion, and the exhilarating chaos of life, Ilara was learning the rhythms of medication schedules and the weight of a sick man's despair. This devotion had left her emotionally untouched, achingly lonely, and profoundly disconnected from the desires of her own body, a stranger in her own skin, haunted by a void she could not name. The Vance estate itself was a gilded cage, a monument to a fortune long since squandered. Situated in a forgotten corner of Boston, its grand facade was crumbling, with ivy creeping over the Palladian windows like a slow-moving disease. Inside, the air was heavy, with the scent of dust and faded grandeur. Sunlight struggled to pierce the grime on the glass, illuminating dust motes dancing over threadbare Persian rugs and furniture shrouded in white sheets like rows of tombstones. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the long, empty hallways, whispered of a legacy of failure. The threat of foreclosure was a constant, unspoken guest at their dinner table, a tightening noose that reminded Ilara that the family's honor, its very survival, rested entirely on her slender, trembling shoulders. Her father, a man who once commanded boardrooms with a voice of thunder, was now a specter confined to a wing-back chair in the gloom of the library. His illness had stripped him of his power, leaving behind a husk of a man whose silence was more demanding than any command he had ever issued. He rarely spoke, but his eyes followed Ilara's every move, their depths swimming with a mixture of pride, desperation, and a terrible, unspoken shame. He was the reason for her cage, the lock on its door. Her love for him was a fierce, protective thing, but it was also the chain that bound her to this house, to this life of quiet servitude. She felt the crushing weight of his unspoken plea, to save him, to save the house, to restore the family name, no matter the cost. To escape the suffocating weight of her reality, Ilara retreated into the pages of the books she mended. She walked the misty moors with tragic heroines, sailed treacherous seas with daring adventurers, and felt the sting of forbidden love in gaslit Victorian parlors. These characters were her only friends, their vibrant, tumultuous lives, a stark and painful contrast to her own pale existence. She would read late into the night, the soft glow of her lamp, a tiny star in the oppressive darkness of the house, her heart aching with a vicarious passion. A deep, dormant yearning stirred within her, a desire for a life that was her own, for a touch that was not born of duty, for a story where she was not merely the dutiful daughter but the heroine of her own epic tale. One late afternoon, as a storm gathered over Boston, Alara worked on a rare edition of Dante's Inferno. The sky outside the workshop window bruised to a deep violet, mirroring the dark, foreboding illustrations on the pages before her. As she carefully reinforced the spine, she traced the image of a soul being led into a world of shadow and consequence. A strange, inexplicable shiver traced its way down her own spine, a premonition as cold and sharp as the rain that had begun to lash against the glass. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. She had no way of knowing that this was the final, quiet moment of her old life. She was on the precipice of her own descent, about to be led into an inferno of the heart by a man more haunted and dangerous than any devil Dante could ever conjure. The city of Boston awakened with a distant, muted roar each morning, a symphony of life Alara could only hear through the thick, time-warped glass of her bedroom window. Her own awakening was a silent, ritualistic affair. The first light of dawn, pale and gray, would filter through the grimy panes, illuminating the peeling damask wallpaper and the fine layer of dust that coated every surface like a shroud. Her routine was an anchor in the shifting tides of anxiety. Dress in the muted colors that made her feel invisible, descend the grand, groaning staircase, and begin the day's duties. The house itself seemed to breathe around her, a great, dying beast whose rattling sighs were the creaks of aging floorboards and the whisper of wind through cracked window frames. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum, and she was its solitary, living ghost, trapped within a legacy of slow, elegant decay. Her father's library was the heart of the house's oppressive gloom. Once a vibrant hub of intellectual debate and cigar smoke, it was now a silent chamber where Arthur Vance presided over the ruins of his life. Alara would enter bearing a tray, the clink of porcelain, a jarring intrusion into the thick silence. He would be sitting in his worn leather armchair, a heavy tartan blanket pooled around his useless legs, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked windows. He rarely spoke, but his eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held a deep, watery desperation that clung to her like a physical weight. He would watch her set down his tea, his hands trembling as he reached for the cup. In his silence, she heard a litany of unspoken demands, for her strength, for her youth, for a miracle she did not possess. His love was a heavy, suffocating blanket, and she wore it every day. The Daily Mail was a ritual of quiet dread. It arrived in a thin bundle, held together by a rubber band, a collection of white and red paper grenades threatening to detonate their fragile peace. Final notices, letters from creditors with increasingly severe language, and official-looking envelopes from the bank were the daily chronicle of their demise. Alara had become an expert at sifting through them, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She would quickly hide the most menacing ones at the bottom of a drawer, a futile attempt to shield her father from the full extent of their freefall. Each letter was a new bar on the cage, a fresh reminder that her work restoring the delicate, gilded spines of books was a pathetic irony. She could mend the pasts of strangers but could do nothing to stop her own future from being torn apart, page by painful page. Once a week, she was forced to venture into the city for specialized supplies, Japanese tissue paper, archival glue, a specific shade of leather dye. These trips were a form of exquisite torture. The world outside the estate's wrought iron gates was a vibrant, chaotic assault on her senses. She moved through the crowded streets of Beacon Hill feeling like a specter from another century, her simple handmade dress, a stark contrast to the modern fashions of the women who hurried past, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. They spoke of careers, of travel, of love lives messy and wonderful. Alara would watch them from behind a curtain of her own shyness and envy, a profound ache of longing settling deep in her bones. The city, with its promise of freedom and anonymity, felt as distant and unattainable as the moon, a world she could observe but never truly join. Her Aunt Beatrice was the self-appointed guardian of the Vance family's faded prestige, a woman whose spine was as rigid as her moral code. She would visit on Tuesdays, her presence sucking the very air from the room. Over weak tea served in chipped porcelain cups, she would speak in veiled yet pointed terms about Ilara's duty. A woman's value, especially in our circumstances, lies in her ability to make a strategic alliance, she'd say, her eyes scanning Ilara's plain face with cold appraisal. Beauty fades, but a good name, a good match that is an asset that can save a legacy. The word marriage was never a promise of love, but a financial transaction, a solution to a problem. Ilara was the last, most valuable piece on a chessboard, being positioned for a sacrifice she was expected to make with quiet, dutiful grace. The workshop was her only sanctuary, the one room in the vast, decaying house that felt truly hers. Here, amidst the orderly clutter of her tools, she could impose a sense of control on a world that was spiraling into chaos. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the sharp, clean scent of bookbinding paste. The meticulous, focused nature of her work was a balm to her frayed nerves. As she carefully stitched a new binding or delicately lifted a fragile, flaking page, the crushing weight of her reality would recede, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of making something broken whole again. This room was her refuge, a pocket of silence and purpose where she could pretend for a few hours that she was not a prisoner of debt and duty, but an artist, a creator, a keeper of stories. It was a beautiful, fragile illusion. Sometimes, a ghost from a happier past would surface. While repairing a tattered copy of Wuthering Heights, a pressed violet fell from between the pages. Its color faded, but its form still perfect. The faint, dusty scent transported her back to a sun-drenched afternoon in the estate's garden, years ago. She was a small girl, her father strong and laughing, lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see over the tall hedges. He had tucked a flower just like this one behind her ear, his touch gentle, his world full of promise. The memory was so vivid it was a physical pain, a sharp, cruel contrast to the silent, broken man in the library. It was a reminder of everything she was fighting to save, and everything she had already lost, fueling the quiet desperation that was now the constant, humming baseline of her existence. The shift was subtle at first, a change in the atmosphere of the house. During one of their tense, mostly silent dinners, her father cleared his throat, a sound so rare it made Ilara flinch. "There has been an inquiry," he began, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on a dark corner of the dining room. "A man of significant means. He understands our delicate position." Aunt Beatrice, seated across from her, gave a small, sharp nod of encouragement. The words were vague, sanitized, but the meaning was as clear as a shard of glass in her heart. An offer had been made. A price had been discussed. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones, the chilling realization that she was no longer just a daughter, but a commodity, a solution being negotiated in hushed tones behind closed doors. Later that night, Ilara stood before the age-spotted mirror in her bedroom, staring at her own reflection as if seeing a stranger. The face that looked back was pale and serious, the eyes wide with a fear she had been suppressing for years. Who was this girl, this silent, obedient shadow, who had let her own life be consumed by the needs of others? A spark of rebellion, quiet but fierce, ignited within her. It wasn't a roar, but a deep, seismic tremor of defiance. For the first time, the desire for something more, a choice, a voice, a life that was truly her own, was not a vague, romantic yearning, but a sharp, undeniable need. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her own heart, a prisoner rattling the bars of its cage, suddenly desperate for escape. The final blow came the following Tuesday. Aunt Beatrice dispensed with all pretense, her words as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "Mr. Thorne is a man of immense power," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "He is willing to settle all of Arthur's debts, to secure this house, your future. In return, he requires a gesture of gratitude, an evening of your company." She framed it as an act of noble sacrifice, the ultimate expression of a daughter's love and duty. The cage door, which had always stood slightly ajar with the illusion of choice, was now slammed shut and bolted. Ilara was trapped, cornered by love, guilt, and the crushing weight of legacy. She was being led to the altar of her family's salvation, and the man waiting for her was a ghost, a ruin, a name whispered in fear and awe. The man who had purchased her family's salvation was a phantom, a whisper in the gilded canyons of finance. His name was Julian Thorne, and he was known by a moniker that was both a warning and a testament to his power: the architect of ruin. He did not build companies. He acquired them, dismantled them with surgical precision, and absorbed their valuable assets into his own sprawling, invisible empire. He was a ghost in the machine of the modern world, a man with no public face, no family, and no past that anyone could trace. He existed only as a name on a contract and a presence felt in the sudden, sharp collapse of fortunes. His domain was a penthouse that pierced the Boston sky, a sterile fortress of glass and steel from which he observed the world below with the detached interest of a god studying an ant farm. He was a creature of shadow and silence, and tonight Ilara was to be delivered into the heart of his darkness. The journey to him was a disorienting passage from one reality to another. A sleek black car, silent as a tomb, had collected her from the crumbling gates of the Vance estate. As it glided through the city streets, the familiar, decaying world of her past blurred into a stream of neon and shimmering glass. Ilara sat stiffly on the cool leather seat, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She felt like a figure from one of her antique books, a provincial girl being transported to the king's forbidding castle. Every light they passed seemed to strip away another layer of her identity, leaving her feeling raw, exposed, and terrifyingly small. She was no longer Ilara Vance, restorer of books and dutiful daughter. She was a debt, an offering, a fragile piece of collateral being moved from one ledger to another. His building was not a home, but a statement of power, a shard of obsidian thrust into the heavens. It loomed over the historic Boston skyline, an architectural anomaly of stark lines and cold, reflective surfaces that seemed to repel the very warmth of the city. There was no doorman, only a silent, seamless panel that slid open as their car approached, leading to a subterranean garage of polished concrete and unnerving silence. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat as she stepped out of the car. The air was cool and sterile, smelling of nothing at all. It was the absolute antithesis of her own home, which was saturated with the organic sense of age, decay, and memory. Here, there was no history, only a crushing, absolute present, a void meticulously curated by the man who awaited her on the highest floor. The elevator was a small mirrored cage, ascending with a silent, terrifying velocity. Ilara watched her own reflection as the floors climbed, the numbers glowing in a serene, digital blue. The woman staring back at her was a pale, wide-eyed stranger, her simple dress looking hopelessly out of place against the gleaming steel. She could feel the pressure changing in her ears, a physical manifestation of her ascent into a world where she did not belong. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that amplified the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. She felt as if she were being pulled from the earth, rising toward an unknown judgment. When the doors finally whispered open, they did so without a sound, revealing a space so vast and empty it felt like stepping into the sky itself. The penthouse was a landscape of cold, minimalist perfection. Polished marble floors stretched out before her, reflecting the glittering panorama of the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows that formed 3 of the 4 walls. The furniture was sparse and geometric, pieces of modern art that offered no comfort, only form. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter, no sign that a human being actually lived here. The air was chilled to a precise, unwavering temperature. It was less a home and more a monument to isolation, a perfectly constructed void, designed to keep the messy, unpredictable world at a permanent, unbridgeable distance. Ilara stood frozen on the threshold, a small, warm-blooded creature who had wandered into a glacier, her every breath feeling like a trespass against the profound, intentional emptiness of the space. And then she saw him. He was standing near the far window, a tall, dark silhouette against the sprawling tapestry of city lights. He turned slowly, not with a start, but with a deliberate, controlled grace that spoke of immense self-possession. Julian Thorne was not handsome in a classical sense. His features were too sharp, too severe, as if carved from granite. He wore a simple black sweater and dark trousers, clothing that made him seem more like a shadow than a man. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a stormy sea, and they held no warmth, no welcome, no discernible emotion at all. They simply watched her, taking in her presence with an unnerving, analytical stillness that made her feel less like a woman and more like a complex problem he was methodically beginning to solve. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken questions and terrifying possibilities. Alara's mind, which had been racing with 1,000 panicked thoughts, went utterly blank. She could only stand and endure his scrutiny, feeling his gaze travel over her simple dress, her trembling hands, her frightened face. He was assessing her, she realized, not with the lecherous appraisal she had dreaded, but with a cool, detached curiosity. It was as if he were examining a rare artifact, noting its flaws, its fragility, its provenance. She felt a strange, paradoxical urge to both run and to stand her ground, to prove that she was more than the sum of her father's debts. A flicker of defiance stirred beneath her fear, a refusal to be completely erased by the sheer force of his presence. He moved from the window, his steps making no sound on the marble floor. He didn't approach her directly, but walked to a low, sleek bar, his movements economical and precise. He poured a single glass of water, the sound of the liquid hitting the crystal a sudden, sharp intrusion into the silence. He still hadn't spoken a word. The entire encounter felt like a dream, a slow-motion sequence in a film where she had forgotten all her lines. He turned back to her, holding the glass. "Follow me," he said. His voice was a low baritone, as devoid of inflection as the rest of him. It was not a request, but a simple statement of fact, an instruction she knew she had no choice but to obey. Her body moved before her mind could protest, her feet carrying her deeper into the heart of his cold, empty kingdom. He led her not to a living area, but down a long, stark hallway to a single, imposing door. He pushed it open, revealing a bedroom that was as austere and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. A large, unadorned bed, draped in a simple gray coverlet, dominated the space. The far wall was another sheet of glass, offering a dizzying, godlike view of the sleeping city. There were no personal effects, save for one object, a single, leather-bound book resting on the nightstand. Alara recognized the worn, familiar tooling of the spine instantly. It was an old edition of Dante's Inferno. The sight of it in this sterile, modern mausoleum was so jarring, so profoundly out of place, that it felt like a clue to a puzzle she couldn't possibly comprehend. It was a piece of her world, inexplicably present in his. Ilara stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, a fragile defense against the oppressive chill and the weight of her own terrifying anticipation. This was it, the moment of payment. She braced herself for his touch, for the consummation of the cruel bargain that had brought her here. But Julian Thorne did not move toward the bed. Instead, he walked past her and stopped by the nightstand. He gestured, not to the mattress, but to a severe, uncomfortable-looking chair positioned near the window. He then tapped a long, elegant finger on the cover of the book. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in their stormy depths. Not desire, but a profound, ancient weariness. "I won't touch you," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Read to me." The request was an instruction, not a question. Ilara's mind, a library of ordered thoughts and quiet anxieties, short-circuited. She stared at him, at the severe lines of his face, the profound emptiness in his eyes, and then at the book on the nightstand, Cius Manu, A Journey Through the 9 Circles of Hell. Of all the terrifying possibilities she had braced herself for, this was the one she could never have conceived. It was an order so bizarre, so intimate in its strangeness, that it disarmed her more completely than any physical threat could have. Her fear, a cold, sharp thing, was suddenly blunted by a wave of profound confusion. Numbly as if moving through water, she crossed the marble floor to the hard, unwelcoming chair. The worn leather of the book felt both shockingly familiar and utterly alien in this cold, sterile room, a relic from her world, transplanted into his. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a fragile, trembling thing, a mere whisper against the vast silence of the penthouse. She began to read, the ancient, rhythmic verses of Dante filling the air. "Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. The words felt heavy, laden with a significance that echoed in the space between them. Julian did not look at her. He remained by the window, a sentinel of sorrow, his back to her as he stared out at the indifferent city lights. Lara could feel his attention focused on her voice with an unnerving intensity, as if he were drinking in the sound, the cadence, the very vibration of the words. She was not reading to a man, she was reading to a wound, a vast and cavernous grief that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. When she reached the end of the third canto, her throat raw, he spoke without turning. "That's enough!" The words were clipped, final. The spell was broken. She closed the book, her hands shaking slightly. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before, thick with unspoken things. He walked to a desk, wrote a check with swift, detached movements, and left it on the polished surface before returning to the window, his dismissal absolute. Ilara rose, took the slip of paper without looking at it, and left the room, her footsteps echoing in the long, empty hall. She felt a dizzying sense of disorientation as she descended in the silent elevator. She had not been touched, not been violated, yet she felt as though a part of her had been excavated, examined, and irrevocably altered by the sheer force of his sorrow. The following days were a study in dissonance. Ilara tried to immerse herself in the familiar comfort of her workshop, the scent of paper and glue a grounding force. But the memory of that night was a persistent ghost, overlaying her reality with its stark, cold imagery. The silence of the Vance estate, once a familiar blanket of oppression, now felt hollow, lacking the charged, waiting quality of Julian's penthouse. She would find herself pausing, her hand hovering over a delicate page, her mind replaying the sound of her own voice reading of damnation in that sky-high mausoleum. The check she had given her father, an amount so large it had left him speechless with relief, felt like payment for a service she couldn't define. She had sold her time, her voice, but it felt as if she had inadvertently bartered a small piece of her soul. A week later, the silent black car appeared at the gates again, a sleek predator returning for its due. This time, as she sat on the cool leather, her fear was a different creature. It was no longer the sharp terror of the unknown, but a dull, anxious thrum of anticipation. She felt a strange, shameful pull toward him, a morbid curiosity about the depths of the darkness he inhabited. When she entered the penthouse, the scene was an unnerving replica of the first night. Julian standing by the window, the city glittering beneath him, the room steeped in a chilling, magnificent loneliness. He turned, his stormy eyes meeting hers with the same unreadable intensity. He didn't speak a word, merely inclined his head toward the chair and the book. The ritual was to begin again, an unspoken contract renewed in the heavy silence. During this second reading, a fragile confidence took root within her. She was no longer just a terrified girl. She was a participant in this strange ceremony, and she began to observe. As she read of the tormented souls, she watched him, studying the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched at certain passages describing betrayal or loss. He was not merely listening. He was reliving something, forcing himself through a penance of his own design with her voice as his guide. She saw the subtle tremor in his hand as he rested it against the cold glass of the window, a crack in the granite facade. A dangerous empathy began to bloom in her chest, a desire to understand the architecture of his pain, to trace the origins of the ruin he so carefully cultivated around himself. The readings became their secret, unacknowledged routine, a bizarre fixture in both their lives. Twice a week, she would ascend to his sterile sanctuary and read from the depths of hell, her voice the only thread connecting them in the vast, silent space. The financial arrangement continued, saving her family from the precipice of ruin, but the nature of their transaction had mutated. It was no longer about debt and payment. It had become a strange, symbiotic exchange of solace and torment. She gave him the sound of a human voice, a steady presence in his self-imposed exile, and in return he gave her a glimpse into a world of power and pain, so immense it made her own gilded cage seem small and fragile. They never spoke of it, but an intimacy, potent and perilous, was being woven in the dark. This growing connection became Ilara's central conflict, a war waged within the quiet confines of her own heart. The dutiful daughter in her was relieved, grateful that she was saving her father and their home. But another part of her, a part she had never known existed, was awakening. She began to anticipate the summons, to feel a thrill of something akin to desire as the silent car approached. This feeling was terrifying. It was a craving for the darkness she saw in him, a compulsion to move toward the very thing a sensible woman would flee. She felt a profound sense of guilt, as if by wanting to be near him, she was betraying the simple, virtuous girl she was supposed to be. She was caught between the safety of her prescribed life and the magnetic pull of his broken one. The fragile equilibrium of their arrangement shattered on a crisp autumn afternoon when he appeared, unannounced, at the door of her workshop. The sight of Julian Thorne, cloaked in a tailored charcoal coat that seemed to absorb the light, standing amidst the gentle, dusty chaos of her sanctuary, was a breathtaking violation of boundaries. He was a creature of steel and glass, and he had stepped into her world of paper and thread. The air crackled with his presence, the familiar, comforting sense of her workshop, suddenly charged with the clean, expensive fragrance of his cologne. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the tools, the stacks of books in various states of repair, his expression one of guarded curiosity, as if he had discovered a rare, uncatalogued species in its natural habitat. He moved deeper into the room, his expensive leather shoes silent on the worn floorboards. His attention was caught by a particularly fragile 16th-century manuscript she was working on, its pages like dried leaves. He reached out a hand, his long fingers hesitating just above the vellum. A flicker of something, longing perhaps, crossed his face before it was replaced by a familiar mask of self-loathing. "I shouldn't," he murmured, more to himself than to her, his voice low and rough. He started to pull his hand back. "I ruin everything I touch." The words were a confession, a warning, and a plea, spoken with such profound, bone-deep conviction that it made Elara's heart ache with a pain that was not her own. In that moment, Elara acted on an impulse that came from a place deeper than thought, deeper than fear. She closed the small distance between them and, without a word, gently took his hand in hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth and life against the unexpected coolness of his skin. His entire body went rigid with shock, but he didn't pull away. She saw a flicker of panic in his eyes, the terror of an animal unused to a gentle touch. Ignoring it, she guided his hand back toward the book, her own fingers covering his as she carefully laid his palm flat against the ancient, resilient page. "It's stronger than it looks," she whispered, her voice steady, a quiet refutation of his entire worldview. The touch lasted only a few seconds, but it reshaped the landscape between them. He snatched his hand back as if the page were hot iron, a muscle twitching in his jaw. A storm of conflicting emotions, fear, confusion, a terrifying flicker of hope, raged in his eyes before he masked it again. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the workshop, the small bell above the door jangling violently in his wake. Elara was left standing in the sudden, ringing silence, her body trembling. The phantom warmth of his skin lingered on her fingertips. The line she had been carefully walking between duty and desire had just been erased. She had touched him, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she wanted to do it again. Julian fought the pull of her with a ferocity born of pure terror. He canceled their next reading, the first he had ever missed. He threw himself into his work, orchestrating a hostile takeover with a ruthless efficiency that unnerved even his most seasoned lawyers. He was trying to bury the memory of her touch, the memory of her quiet voice telling him something wasn't fragile, under an avalanche of demolition and control. She was an anomaly, a variable he could not quantify or contain. Her gentleness was more threatening than any corporate rival because it targeted the one vulnerability he could not armor, the deeply buried conviction that he was worthy of something other than solitude and punishment. To be near her was to risk infecting her with his own blight, and that was a sin he would not commit. For Elara, his silence was a unique form of torture. The absence of the black car, the lack of a summons, left a void in her week that was both a relief and a profound disappointment. She found herself watching the gates from her workshop window, her heart leaping at the sound of any passing engine. The realization of how much she had come to depend on their strange ritual horrified her. She was no longer just a paid companion. She was emotionally invested in a man who was, by his own admission, a force of destruction. The moral dilemma had sharpened to a razor's edge. Was she saving her family out of duty, or was she now willingly walking into the dark, drawn by a hope so faint and foolish it felt like a form of madness? He reappeared 2 weeks later, not in the car but on foot, materializing at the workshop door like an apparition in the late afternoon gloom. He looked exhausted, as if he had been at war with himself and lost. He offered no apology or explanation for his absence. He simply stood on her threshold, holding a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was a pot of lapis lazuli pigment, a rare and incredibly expensive shade of blue she had once mentioned in passing during a conversation about medieval illumination. The gesture was so specific, so thoughtful, it was more intimate than any touch. It was an admission that he listened, that he remembered, that even when he was away, a part of his mind was still with her. The air in the small workshop grew thick and heavy, charged with the volatile current of their shared longing and restraint. He didn't leave. He simply stood and watched her work, his presence a silent, powerful weight in the room. Ilara tried to focus on the delicate task of tooling a leather spine, but her hands trembled. She was intensely aware of every small detail of him, the way the light caught the silver at his temples, the faint, clean scent of rain on his coat, the sheer heat and energy that radiated from his body, warming the cool air around him. The unspoken desire that had hummed between them for weeks was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It was a palpable force, a third entity in the room, coiling in the silence, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of charged silence, he spoke, his voice a low, rough sound that seemed scraped from the very depths of his soul. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" The question was not an accusation, but a raw, vulnerable plea for understanding. He was not asking about his reputation or his power. He was asking about the poison he believed he carried within him. Ilara stopped her work, lifting her gaze to meet his. The full force of his pain, his loneliness, his desperate need for an answer, hit her. And in that moment, she had no logical response, only the stunning, terrifying truth that pulsed through her veins. She wasn't afraid. She saw past the architect of ruin to the ruins inside the man, and some reckless, vital part of her wanted nothing more than to build something new there. Her answer to his raw, vulnerable question was not found in words, but in the sudden, terrifying silence that followed. In that charged space, the shrill ring of the telephone on her desk was a violent intrusion, a sound from a world she no longer felt a part of. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was her Aunt Beatrice, calling to remind her of the dinner engagement that evening, a carefully arranged meeting with a bland, respectable heir to a shipping fortune, the safe harbor her family had chosen for her. The phone continued its insistent shriek, a summons back to duty, to the gilded cage. Julian's gaze never left hers, his eyes filled with a pained anticipation. In that moment, the choice became brutally simple. Answer the call and return to her life as a carefully preserved artifact. Or let it ring and finally, irrevocably, claim a life of her own. Ignoring the piercing summons, Ilara took a single deliberate step toward him. The floorboards of her sanctuary, a space that had only ever known her quiet solitude, did not creak. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. She saw the confusion and a flicker of fear dawn in his eyes as she closed the small distance between them. This was a transgression far greater than touching a book. She was crossing the invisible, heavily fortified perimeter he had built around his soul. Her heart was a wild, frantic bird, beating against the cage of her ribs, not with fear, but with a dizzying, powerful sense of purpose. For the first time, she was not reacting to duty or succumbing to pressure. She was acting out of pure, undiluted want, a force so new and potent it threatened to consume her. She lifted a trembling hand, the one that knew how to mend the most fragile of things, and laid her fingers gently against the sharp, unyielding line of his jaw. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through his entire body, but he did not pull away. His skin was cool, stretched taut over the bone, with the faint, rough texture of an afternoon shadow. His stillness was absolute, the self-control of a man bracing for an impact he had spent a lifetime avoiding. She watched as a war raged in the stormy depths of his eyes, the instinct to flee warring with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion and a desperate, unspoken yearning to finally be still. Her touch was not a question but a statement, a quiet declaration that she saw the man, not the monster, and she was not turning back. With a surge of courage that felt both foreign and fundamentally true, Ilara rose onto her toes, tilted her head, and pressed her lips to his. It was a clumsy, desperate kiss, born not of experience, but of a lifetime of deferred longing, a vicarious passion gleaned from the pages of forgotten novels. It was the taste of rain and something metallic, like unshed tears. For a single, heart-stopping second, he remained rigid, a statue of resistance. She felt the cold finality of his rejection, a wave of shame washing over her. But then, a low sound, a guttural groan of surrender tore from his throat, and the dam of his control did not just crack, it shattered into 1,000 pieces. The world tilted on its axis, and she was no longer the one leading. She was being consumed. His mouth crashed down on hers, and the kiss was no longer a tentative exploration, but a raw, desperate claiming. It was a deluge of all the loneliness, all the pain, all the hunger he had kept locked away in the sterile silence of his sky-high fortress. His hands, which had been clenched into fists at his sides, came up to tangle in her hair, his grip possessive, almost bruising, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss. He tasted of scotch and sorrow. This was not the gentle, romantic union she had read about. It was a collision, a violent, beautiful storm that swept away all thought, all reason, leaving only a raw, elemental need. She clung to him, meeting his ferocity with her own, a silent scream of a soul that had been quiet for far too long, finally finding its voice. They broke apart, gasping for air, their chests heaving in the dusty, ink-scented atmosphere of the workshop. Ilara's legs felt weak, and she braced her hands against the hard wall of his chest, feeling the frantic, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing ragged and uneven. The room, her quiet sanctuary, was now a crucible, the air thick with the aftermath of their collision, charged with a dangerous, irreversible intimacy. The faint scent of old paper and leather now mingled with the sharp, clean fragrance of his skin, creating something new and intoxicating. The silence that fell was not empty. It was filled with the deafening roar of a boundary that had been utterly and completely annihilated. His eyes opened, and the stormy gray was dark with a self-loathing so profound it made her ache. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice rough, broken. "You have to leave. You don't understand what you're doing." It was a plea, a desperate final attempt to erect a wall between them, to push her back into the light before his darkness could stain her permanently. He was trying to protect her from himself, invoking the specter of the ruin he believed he was destined to create. The words were a test, a final offering of an escape she knew, with every fiber of her being, she no longer wanted. He was offering her the safety of her cage, but she had already tasted the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of the sky. She looked directly into his tormented eyes, her own gaze clear and unwavering. The timid, dutiful girl had been burned away in the heat of their kiss, leaving behind a woman she was only just beginning to recognize. "I'm not a fragile manuscript, Julian," she said, her voice quiet but imbued with an unshakable strength. "Stop trying to handle me with care. I know exactly what I'm doing." She was not choosing him to save her family or to fulfill a duty. She was choosing him for herself, with full knowledge of the shadows that clung to him. It was the most defiant act of her life, a final, severing cut from the strings of expectation that had bound her for so long. She was choosing this man, this pain, this uncertain, dangerous path, because it was the first thing that had ever felt truly real. For a long moment he simply stared at her, his expression shifting from pained warning to a kind of raw, astonished wonder. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, not as an innocent to be protected or a debt to be managed, but as a woman with a will as strong as his own. The last of his resistance crumbled, not in a violent crash, but in a slow, quiet surrender. A look of profound, weary acceptance settled on his features. With a movement that was no longer hesitant, but filled with a raw, undeniable certainty, he bent and swept her into his arms. The sudden ascent stole her breath. He held her as if she were both infinitely precious and the only anchor in a storm, his face buried in the curve of her neck. He carried her through the archway into the small, private antechamber of her workshop, a room with a simple cot where she sometimes rested during long nights of work. He laid her down gently amidst the scent of turpentine and old wood, the setting a stark bohemian contrast to the sterile luxury of his world. There, as the last of the afternoon light filtered through the grimy windowpane, he showed her a different kind of ruin, not one of demolition, but of utter, soul-bearing surrender. Their joining was not an act of possession, but a desperate, mutual search for sanctuary. It was the quiet, reverent touch of a man who believed he was poison, finally allowing himself to be held, and the fierce, loving embrace of a woman who had spent her life mending broken things, finally finding the one soul she was truly meant to restore. The dawn that followed was not a gentle arrival of light, but a cold, clinical unveiling of reality. Ilara awoke on the narrow cot in her workshop, the rough wool blanket, a poor and solitary comfort. She was alone. The profound silence of the room was a physical weight, pressing down on her. Yet the air was not empty. It was thick with the ghost of his presence, a lingering phantom fragrance of rain-soaked wool and the clean, sharp scent of his skin, now irrevocably mingled with the familiar dust of paper and glue. She sat up, her body feeling both foreign and fundamentally altered, as if she had been unmade and remade in the crucible of the night. The desperate, soul-bearing intimacy felt like a fever dream, a beautiful, violent storm that had passed, leaving behind a silence more desolate and absolute than any she had ever known. She had transgressed, and this hollow, ringing solitude was her immediate consequence. Miles away, in his glass fortress suspended above the sleeping city, Julian stood under a torrent of scalding water, as if he could physically flay the memory of her from his skin. He was not triumphant, he was ravaged. Every place her hands had touched, her lips had met, felt branded upon his flesh. A searing mark of his ultimate failure. He had finally done it. Taken the one pure, resilient thing that had ever breached his defenses, and dragged it into the mire of his own damnation. Their union had not been a release, but a horrifying confirmation of his deepest-held conviction. He was poison. The walls he had so carefully constructed had been shattered not by force, but by a quiet tenderness he could not withstand. Now he rebuilt them with a frantic, desperate energy, using bricks of self-loathing and a mortar of bitter regret, determined to become the unfeeling monster she had refused to see. Returning to the main house was like stepping through a veil into a past life, a regression into a role she no longer fit. The grand, decaying rooms seemed to watch her with a new, accusatory stillness. The missed, shrieking call from her aunt the night before was a palpable presence, a debt of explanation she felt no compulsion to pay. She could feel the irrevocable change in her own body. She walked differently. Her senses were sharper, and the secret of what had transpired in the workshop hummed beneath her skin like a low-voltage current. The gilded cage, which had once been the entirety of her world, now felt suffocatingly small, its bars forged from duties she no longer recognized as her own. She was a ghost in her own home, haunted not by the specters of the past, but by the terrifying, vibrant memory of a life she had touched for only a few fleeting, transformative hours. Her Aunt Beatrice did not require an explanation. She arrived that afternoon, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury, and the truth was an unspoken certainty that hung between them in the oppressive air of the library. "You fool," Beatrice hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "You had one task, to secure our future. Instead, you throw it all away for a moment of pathetic, common indulgence with a man like that." She didn't raise her voice. Her words were more effective as sharp, precise cuts designed to bleed Ilara of her newfound strength. "He is a user of things, Ilara. Of companies. Of people. Do you truly believe you were anything more than a momentary diversion? You have not saved this family. You have merely finalized the price of your own ruin, and you have paid it with a pathetic, girlish willingness." Ilara stood before the onslaught of her aunt's condemnation, and felt a strange, unprecedented calm settle over her like a shroud. The words which a month ago would have shattered her fragile sense of duty and self-worth now seemed to glance off an invisible armor she hadn't known she possessed. The guilt was present, a familiar, dull ache in her chest, but it was no longer the defining force of her existence. Beneath it, a new foundation had set, forged in the heat of her own deliberate choice. She had not been a passive victim swept away by circumstance. She had acted, she had wanted, she had chosen. The consequences were terrifying and painful, but the act itself had been liberating. She met her aunt's cold, furious glare not with defiance or tears, but with a quiet, unbreachable stillness. In that moment, she realized she was no longer a prisoner rattling her cage, but a woman standing in its open door. The final blow was delivered not with venom, but with the cold, impersonal efficiency of Julian's world. A motorcycle courier, anonymous in a helmet and black leather, handed her a crisp, legal-sized envelope. There was no personal note, no hint of the man who had surrendered in her arms with such raw vulnerability. Inside, she found a cashier's check for an astronomical sum, enough to erase every debt and secure the estate for generations. Tucked behind it was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper, bearing a single typed sentence. "This concludes our arrangement." The corporate finality of the words was a brutal negation of everything that had passed between them. It was a dismissal, a severance, reducing their desperate, profound connection to a mere transaction. The paper felt like ice in her hand, the pain sharper and more absolute than any insult her aunt could ever devise. Julian plunged himself into a self-imposed exile, transforming his sterile penthouse from a fortress into a true prison cell. He worked with a demonic, destructive energy, orchestrating a corporate dismantling so ruthless it sent shockwaves through the financial markets. He was actively, consciously becoming the monster she had refused to believe he was, a form of brutal self-flagellation. He sealed off the bedroom where she had read to him, the door now a permanent monument to his transgression. The silence he had once curated for peace was now a torment, echoing with the ghost of her voice reciting verses of damnation. He had pushed her away to save her from his blight, but in doing so, he had locked himself in a circle of hell far worse than any Dante had ever conceived, one where he was both the sinner and the eternal, solitary jailer. She presented the check to her father in the dim, silent library, laying the slip of paper on the small table beside his armchair. He picked it up, his frail hands trembling as he read the numbers. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over his tired features. He was saved. The house was safe. But when he looked up at her, the relief in his eyes was eclipsed by a deep, bottomless sorrow. He saw the change in her, the shadow of experience that now resided in her gaze, and his expression was one of silent, heartbreaking judgment. He didn't have to speak the words. She heard them in the funereal quiet of the room. He had gotten his salvation, but he believed it had cost him his daughter's soul. This unspoken understanding became a new, colder wall between them, a consequence far heavier than any foreclosure notice. Her workshop, once a refuge of quiet purpose, now felt like a mausoleum for a single incandescent memory. The air, scrubbed clean of his scent by the passing days, felt thin and sterile. She would stand before the narrow cot, the space where he had laid her down with such desperate reverence, and feel the phantom ache of his touch, the echo of his surrender. She tried to lose herself in her work, but her hands, which had known the contours of his face and the fierce strength of his shoulders, felt clumsy and foreign. Her familiar tools felt like dead weight. Her gaze would inevitably fall upon the small, exquisite pot of lapis lazuli pigment on her workbench. It was a vibrant, mocking blue, a testament to a moment of startling thoughtfulness from a man who now treated her as a concluded business deal, a shard of beauty from a shattered world. Weeks bled into a month of monotonous, hollow days. Ilara moved through her life in a state of quiet shock, feeling discarded and profoundly alone. She had done her duty, saved her family, and in return, her heart had been methodically broken and paid for. One evening, as she swept the dusty floor of the workshop, her broom uncovered a single, dark gray thread of cashmere near the leg of the cot. It was a tiny, insignificant remnant of his coat, of him. She picked it up, rolling it between her thumb and forefinger. As she felt its soft texture, a feeling other than grief began to smolder in the pit of her stomach. It was a slow, quiet burn of anger. She was not a contract to be terminated. She was not a fragile object he had broken. He had shown her his deepest wounds, and she had shown him her strength. He was wrong, she realized with a jolt of stunning clarity. He was wrong about everything. That single insignificant thread became the anchor for her resolve. It was not a memento of a lover, but a piece of evidence, tangible proof against the lie he had so carefully constructed. The anger that had been smoldering within her finally coalesced, not into a destructive fire, but into a beam of clarifying light. Julian Thorne had built a prison of self-loathing and convinced himself he was the monster locked inside. He believed his touch brought only ruin, a conviction born of a tragedy he could not outrun. But she knew better. She had felt his touch, not as a destructive force, but as a desperate, reverent plea for connection. He was not a monster. He was a man in mourning for a part of himself he thought was lost forever. And she, the restorer of broken things, would not allow him to remain a ruin. She would not be dismissed. She would not be paid off. She would go back. Her return to his world was a deliberate reversal of her first journey. She did not wait for his silent, funereal car but hailed a common city taxi, the fare a small, defiant purchase of her own agency. As she ascended in the mirrored elevator, she met her own gaze, not with the terrified apprehension of a sacrificial lamb, but with the calm, steady focus of a woman on a mission. The rising numbers no longer signaled an ascent to judgment, but a climb toward a necessary truth. The sterile, silent opulence of his world no longer intimidated her. It looked fragile, a hollow shell built to contain a profound and cavernous loneliness. She was not here to be saved or to be used. She was here to offer a different kind of restoration, one that required no special tools, only the unwavering conviction that he was fundamentally, tragically, wrong about himself. She stepped out into the vast, empty foyer, the silence more profound than she remembered. She walked to the imposing steel door of his private quarters, and, instead of knocking, she pressed the button for the intercom, her touch firm. A moment later, his voice, rough with disuse and laced with venom, crackled through the speaker. "Whatever it is you want, you've been paid for it. Leave." The words were designed to be a wall, a final, brutal dismissal. But Ilara did not flinch. She leaned closer to the speaker, her own voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight that cut through the static and the silence. "I'm not here for the money, Julian," she said, her tone even and clear. "You don't get to decide what this was. Open the door." It was not a plea. It was a command, an assertion of her place in his story, a story he was no longer allowed to write alone. The door slid open with a faint hiss, revealing him standing in the shadows. He was a specter, thinner, his face etched with the sharp lines of sleeplessness and self-inflicted torment. The architect of ruin looked well and truly ruined. "I told you to go," he rasped, his eyes a maelstrom of pain and fury. "I will destroy you, Ilara. It is all I know how to do." He was trying to summon the monster, to scare her away with the myth he had so carefully cultivated. But she saw only the terrified man behind the mask. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she slowly opened her palm, revealing the single, dark gray thread of cashmere resting there. It was a tiny, fragile thing against the pale skin of her hand, an insignificant scrap that held the entire weight of their shared, unspoken truth. It was the undeniable proof of a night that was not a transaction, but a surrender. His gaze fell upon the thread, and the formidable armor of Julian Thorne disintegrated into dust. A shudder racked his entire body, a tremor that seemed to begin in the very foundation of his soul. His carefully constructed walls, which had withstood corporate wars and personal tragedy, crumbled at the sight of this one, tiny, intimate detail. "How?" he whispered, the word a broken, hollow sound. It wasn't a question about the thread, but about her. How could she see this, remember this, and still be standing here? He looked at her, his defenses gone, leaving only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "I am not. I can't be what you think I am," he choked out, a final, desperate confession of his own perceived unworthiness. He was a man drowning in his own darkness, finally admitting he did not know how to swim. Ilara closed the final few feet between them, her movements gentle and deliberate. She took his hand, the one he believed brought only destruction, and curled his fingers around the small thread, closing his fist around it. "You're right," she said softly, her voice the first note of true warmth to grace this cold, empty space in months. "You're not a monster. You're just a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time." She looked up into his shattered, stormy eyes, offering not a cure, but a simple, profound promise of presence. "Let me help you breathe again." The gilded cage was gone, and the ghost was no longer alone. Their real story, a quiet, difficult restoration of the soul, was only just beginning. If you believe their journey toward healing is one worth taking, share your thoughts in the comments below. We invite you to subscribe, like, and share this story so that more people can find a little light in the darkness.